Hello, LifePoint. So here we go again. We're going to be looking at something I said on Sunday, February 11th, and I want to make it a little more clear and expand on it as we were talking about Christ and where he is in the Old Testament and how it all ties together. If you haven't had a chance to look at the typology and understanding linguistics and language as pointed out by Peter Leidart through his book, A House for My Name, then you can watch that one as well, along with the study guide with it. And hopefully it helps you with what we're talking about here today. I had mentioned how the tree of knowledge of good and evil wasn't just that Adam would have a knowledge of what is right and what is wrong, what is good and what is evil, like the Lord has, but that what it actually means is it's talking about a judicial knowledge. Judicial means the ability to pass judgment. And I want to talk about that here today, flesh that out a little bit more. So we're looking at a book by James B. Jordan and taking an excerpt from that called Primeval Saints. And so we're going to jump into a couple different chapters and bounce around. You can see on the study guide, and hopefully that helps. In Hebrews 6, we read that true Christians are, Hebrews 6:12, imitators of those who through faith and patience inherit the promises. For when God made the promises to Abraham, since he could swear by no one greater, he swore by himself, saying, Blessing I will bless you, and multiplying I will multiply you. And thus, having patiently waited, he obtained the promise. Hebrews 6:12-15. The recipients of the letter to the Hebrews knew that Jesus Christ had conquered Satan and was now enthroned king of the world. They wondered why they did not see all things put under his feet. Hebrews 2:8 tells us that. The answer for them was that God had sworn that they would, in time, inherit the promise, Hebrews 6:12-18, what we just read. And so they should be patient. Just as Jesus was perfected through wisdom, inducing suffering, Hebrews 2:10, so we as Christians must patiently endure suffering until we are ready to be invested with authority. This whole idea that the eating of the fruit and the fall of mankind came because man was disobedient, and isn't God partly to blame because he put the tree there to stumble, cause them to stumble, and he brought evil in, and all these misconceptions about what the true sin actually was. And the importance of patience and faith begins really in the garden. And so let's look at Adam's impatience and see that it was much more than Adam just wanting to be like God, but Adam taking something that was not his to take. When God created Adam and set him to guard the Garden of Eden, he told him, From any tree of the garden you may eat freely, but from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat from it you will surely die. Genesis 2:16-17. It's important to note that Adam knew that death was a concept prior to sin. And I think for some this is something where you may have never processed this before, but this means that not only did Adam know that death was a possibility, but Adam had to know that there was good and there was evil, or at least good and bad. I don't know in what form, but he understood that death was a possibility. That is not something that came from the fall. This is something set up before the fall. And so the phrase that we just read, that he may eat from any tree, is a familiar phrase, and it's so well known to us often, we don't recognize that God really told Adam and Eve, you may eat from any tree initially. It says, after Eve had been created, God told Adam and Eve that every food-bearing tree he created for them was for them to eat. Genesis 1:29, Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of all the earth, and every tree in which is the fruit of a tree yielding seed, and it will be food for you. We know this is after Eve because God created Eve, as we see in Genesis 1:28, the preceding verse, so he's speaking to both of them. What does this mean? It means that the prohibition of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil was temporary. Adam and Eve knew they would be allowed to eat of the tree one day if they were patient, and therefore also gained the knowledge that contained therein it. The test before them was not just a test of their obedience, a command from God that they had to obey blindly, but it was to build patience and the hope of a reward. This is so vital for our understanding today and the way God continues to this very day to test us, grow us, mature us. And so the Bible explains to us that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is associated with enthronement and rule. Remember, Adam is the ruler of the garden. Anytime Adam meets with the presence of God, where does he meet him? In the garden. In this time, they don't just live in this little garden. And again, this is another flannel graph Bible study rule of mine that I had, which was Adam and Eve just lived in the garden. And it's this beautiful little paradise with waterfalls and butterflies. And they lived in the garden. All the animals came to them. That garden is where they meet with the presence of God. It's where they would walk and talk with the Lord. But they had free roam of the rest of the land around the garden. It is to do with privilege of making judicial pronouncements. In Genesis 1, we repeatedly see God pronouncing that things are good. Adam was to understand that he was not yet ready or mature enough to make pronouncements regarding good and evil until the time he was supposed to accept God's judgments of what is good and evil by faith. Adam was not to take hold of the fruit and seize the prerogative of rule. He was not to take hold of the fruit and then thusly give himself the authority to make judicial judgments on what was good and evil. That's the real sin. That's the real test that comes, and that's the temptation that comes through the serpent, Lucifer, fallen angel, which is, why not? Haven't you earned it? You can make judgments. You are not going to die. The kind of knowledge that is spoken of here, once again, is not moral knowledge of right and wrong. Adam already had that. He also knew the difference between life and death prior to the fall, but a judicial knowledge, which was purposefully being withheld until he was mature enough to know the difference. We understand this with children. Children know right from wrong really early on. It's written on their hearts. Scriptures tell us this. Yet they are not mature or experienced enough to pass judgment on situations. Parents tell them what to do, and they are to obey. The Bible speaks of children as those in Deuteronomy 139 who have no knowledge of good or evil. It is adults, and especially rulers, who have this judicial knowledge. In fact, even King Solomon, the wisest man to ever live, prayed to be given an understanding heart to judge your people, to discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge this weighty people of yours? 1 Kings 3:9. He was already king. And yet, even in that position, Solomon did not presume that he already possessed the judicial knowledge. Rather, he asks God for it, and God granted it. And this is seen in the very next act in 1 Kings 3. It shows Solomon exercising this judicial knowledge. We also see this from his father, David, who was told that he is to be king. He is being chased unfairly and unjustly by Saul, the current king, who is trying to kill him, thus stopping the prophecy of the Lord, the prophecy that is on his life. He has multiple chances to take the kingdom from Saul, to kill Saul, and he doesn't. And then even repents before Saul when he cuts a piece of his cloak off in the cave, knowing that even that action was not right, that he is not to take what has not yet been given to him. It takes years of training and experience to come to this point of being able to pass good judgment. The book of Hebrews comments on this, and it says in Hebrews 5:14, "Solid food is for the mature, who because of practice have their senses trained to discern good and evil." This is why no matter how on fire a Christian is, how wonderful they are, how giving they are, how loving they are, if they have not been a Christian for a long time, and the Bible speaks to this, do not put those in authority who are immature in the faith, then when you put somebody in a position of teacher who has not been a believer for a long time, you set them up for failure. You set them up in positions to have to pass judgments in people's lives on what is good and what is evil. And even though they're full of the Spirit and God's presence and they're reading and they're growing, they're not there yet, right? The experience Adam did not have, and Adam was to refrain from the tree of judicial knowledge until God was ready to give it to him, because the judicial authority is never to be taken. It is always to be given. As we look again at the book of Hebrews, indirectly comments on Adam's impatience in chapter 5, verse 1. It says, "Every high priest is appointed." We know that Adam is the first high priest, and he was not appointed. He did not wait for his appointment. He took it. If we read further, we come to verse 4, and it says, "And no one takes the honor to himself, but receives it when he is called by God, even as Aaron was. So also Christ did not glorify himself so as to become a high priest." It was after his earthly labors that Jesus was, quote, in verse 10 of Hebrews 5, designated by God as a high priest. Christ himself did not take the title, did not take the judicial authority. He waited until God the Father placed it upon him, and that's when his ministry began. Incredible. You can see the depth of it now. You can see why it says we cannot let man eat from the tree of life, and how that was a kindness to man. Because if he had, we would have gone on eternally separated from God, doing it our own way, proclaiming our own what is right and what is wrong. And to this day, this is what mankind does. But there's an end to our lives now. There's an end to the sin, and it can only progress so far. And we'll talk about that later on in the series. With all this in mind, we can better understand Adam's sin. He refused to wait for God to give him permission to eat the forbidden fruit. He refused to remain a child of God. Remember, he was also the guardian of the garden, protecting and guarding the glory of God. And he refused to wait until he was mature enough to handle the load. Instead, he seized the fruit and set himself up as a judicial authority. God honors his decision, though, it says. He gave Adam authority, but only outside the garden. No longer would Adam have authority inside the garden or ever have it inside the garden. In fact, it would not be until Jesus Christ that a man would be permitted back into God's heavenly garden and be given judicial authority once again. Even the judicial authority that comes upon Abraham and Noah and the patriarchs of the Bible, of the Old Testament, it's always outside the garden. And so, this is an abiding temptation before all men ever since Adam, and it's to seize privileges and prerogatives rather than wait for them to be bestowed. Jesus warned about this actually in a parable recorded in Luke 14, 7 through 11, and I want to close with this. And he began speaking a parable to the invited guests when he noticed how they had been picking out the places of honor at the table, saying to them, "When you are invited by someone to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, lest someone more distinguished than you may have been invited by him, and he who invited you both shall come and say to you, 'Give place to this man.' And then in disgrace you proceed to occupy the last place. But when you are invited, go and recline at the last place, so that when the one who has invited you comes, he may say to you, 'Friend, move up higher.' Then you will have honor in the sight of all who recline at the table with you. For everyone who exalts himself shall be humbled, and he who humbles himself shall be exalted." I can remember one of the very first times that I was invited to be in the presence of a political leader in our country. It was our governor here in Arizona. And there were about 20 to 30 pastors who were invited to come and pray with him. And we went up to the offices, and we were all standing in there, and we were told to take a seat. And I hadn't been thinking about it. I didn't even know where the governor would sit. I just grabbed a seat at the table, and then there were some seats on the outside of the room, not on the outside part of the table as well, like a second row of seats, because there were too many pastors there than there were seats at the table. And I can remember that as a pastor who was much more senior than me came in, and who knew the governor at the time came in, and he had come up to me and taps me on the shoulder and says, "Hey, I'm going to sit here." And it was so awkward, and so I had no idea. I didn't even realize I was doing it, but I had sat in a place of authority. It was only a couple seats down from where the governor would be sitting. And so I had to get up, and I moved to one of the back row seats. And this verse, every time I read it, reminds me of that time, to be aware that you do not take what is not yours to take. And I think in the church, when we understand that Adam's sin was not just disobedience to God, it was to take the place of God, to take the place of one who passes judgments on situations of what is good and what is bad. But we haven't had that bestowed upon us by the Lord yet. This is why in Scripture it says, "Not many of you should become pastors or teachers, because you'll be held to a higher standard." As a pastor or a teacher, you're pronouncing judgments on what is good and what is evil. You're speaking into people's lives on what is good and what is evil, and having to make decisions. For me, was an incredible revelation in reading this to understand the greater depth of Adam's sin. And then what we see is this get continually played out in mankind, even in Noah with his son Ham, right? We often think Noah was disgraced by being naked. He got drunk and got naked after the ark, and he did this shameful thing. That's completely false. Noah did not do a shameful thing. It clearly says he was in his tent. His tent was not some little teepee that was set up and the door was open and you could see him. It was his home. He was in his bedroom in his home, and he had taken off his robe and fallen asleep after having some wine to drink. So This idea that Noah was a drunkard or Ham had any sort of sexual motivation, there was some deviance going on, is all false. It's all perverted, counterfeit ways to look at the scripture. The scripture is exactly what it says. Noah falls asleep. He takes his robe, which signified his kingship. Noah, at this time, by the way, is king of the world. He is given judicial judgment. He is given judicial authority by God after the flood to rename the animals. He does the sacrifice, says, I realize I am here not because of my righteousness, but because of the fact that God has spared me. And so he sacrificed the animals in his place. And so God gives him new judicial authority. And he is to proclaim judgments. And there is a whole new world that happens after the flood. And when we see that he is in his rest and he goes into his room in a private place, takes off his robe, which is his authority, the robes signify authority. We see that in the story of Joseph as well, his coat of many colors. It signifies his authority and his love from his father. He takes off his robe, and what does Ham do? Ham goes into his room, sees that his father is naked, sees that the robe has been placed aside, and brings it out to his brothers, Shem and Japheth. It's because what they're essentially saying is, we carry the robe. Whoever holds the robe and has the robe, we could take the power. We can take the judicial authority of this new world upon ourselves. And the brothers cannot believe what he's done. And it's important. It says that they placed the robe on their shoulders. This is symbolic. They didn't need to do this. They could have told their brother, you're ridiculous, get out of here, go take it back. They could have just walked it back in their hands and walked backwards and placed it. But they walked backwards so as to not look upon their father. And they placed it on their shoulders, which in that time is a symbol of pillars. The shoulders are pillars, essentially saying we will carry the mantle back to our Father. It is not ours to carry, and so we will walk in backwards, not to look upon him and pretend to be carrying any authority, but we place it on the shoulders, on the pillars, and we place his authority back on him. Once again, what does Ham do? Takes authority that is not his. And what happens to Ham? More to come on that in the coming series. But he has a similar fall as Adam. And ultimately, God is going to bring an end to mankind's ability to gather together and pursue what is not theirs in rebellion. And we'll see that at the Tower of Babel. Hope this has been informative and you've enjoyed it. I enjoy doing this. We'll see you Sunday. God bless.